Let's look at the summary of Mr. Van Kampen's notes on the Antichrist. And by the way, I don't think, let me say this before I get started. I don't personally believe that the European model and the Islamic model actually have to clash. I think there can be some synthesis between the two positions, so where we can have a little bit of kind of strengths from both sides and bring them both to the table and see how prophecy will allow us to glean the take away the best parts of both of those particular models without them having to clash so much like they've done historically in the past. But we'll get to that in time. Let's look at the summary of what we learned as we read through Mr. Van Kampen's notes. This is my own little summary that I put together. And after this, we'll draw this part of our study to a close, and I hope that you can stick around for segment 2. Here's my own notes that I put together. This is a summary. According to Robert Van Kampen's research, the notes from this chapter delve into the striking parallelism between Antiochus Epiphanes and Antichrist as outlined in the prophecies of Daniel. So this is a kind of a summary of where we have gone in this particular segment of topic number 6 about this look at Antiochus through the lens of Robert Van Kampen. I continue. Van Kampen emphasizes in his book the resemblance in character and activities between these two despots, highlighting Antiochus' conquest and devastation of Israel during the 2nd century BC and the anticipated actions of Antichrist during the end times. So you see there's a lot of detail that we find in Daniel, we're going to talk about here in a moment, that we can gain a lot of insight from if we look first at what took place historically with Antiochus Epiphanes, with a view towards the coming Antichrist who's going to be hitting the scene in the future. My summary continues. We especially noted during this segment how Van Kampen references multiple chapters in the book of Daniel, most notably, I say Daniel 11:28 through 36, within this chapter to demonstrate the transition from Antiochus to Antichrist, underscoring the latter's self-exaltation. Speaking of Antiochus himself, his blasphemous words against God and eventual prosperity until the time of divine judgment. So in both cases, what we find when we read not just through Daniel, but we find this when we read eventually later on through Paul's letters in Thessalonians, as well as John's later details in the book of Revelation, we find that no matter how bad it gets for the people of God, no matter how tribulational, how much heat is turned up during the time period of the tribulation, God will always step in and rescue his people. And in this regard, we can see a direct parallel to what we're going to eventually talk about one day in my studies, is the what we call the greater Exodus principle. Those in Messianic circles are fond of reminding themselves that when they read through end-time prophecy, and they're studying the book like the book of Revelation, that there are parallels between what takes place at the beginning of the book, the earlier part of the book, like in the book of Revelation, the book of Exodus, and the end of the book, the book of Revelation. So we have parallels there. We have a parallel between the first Exodus from Egypt of God's people and this greater Exodus, this final Exodus in the book of Revelation, where God's going to once again rescue his people from the cruel oppression of these wicked rulers who seek to destroy and to judge Israel and the people of God. Part of those parallels include the supernatural protection from God himself, just like in the Exodus, where God protected Israel during the 10 plagues with the kind of what we call the Goshen principle. Israel didn't suffer the intense brunt of all the plagues, at least when we started getting to the latter end of the plagues. Some of them affected them, right? But for the most part, the principle is that God knows how to protect those who are his own, those who are in covenant with him. And so we'll see parallels to that as well as we get towards the end of the time. Yes, there will be persecution, though. There was persecution in the times of the Pharaohs, right? God's people suffered under the cruel hand of the Pharaohs. But God didn't forget. That's the point I'm trying to highlight, is that God did not forget his people. He heard their cries, he heard their groanings, and he sent a deliverer, right? Moses and Aaron. He sent his spokesman to tell Pharaoh face to face, let my people go. Well, we're going to have the two witnesses in the book of Revelation who are also going to be defying Antichrist during that time. We're going to have the 144,000 Jewish people who were supernaturally protected with the seal on their forehead, who are also defying the Antichrist. And we'll also have our modern day Maccabees in that time period who are going to be resisting the program of the Antichrist. But ultimately, it's God himself who is going to step in and win the day for not just his people, but for his kingdom and for his Messiah, and establish his son's kingdom here on planet Earth. So that's the point that we can look forward to with great expectation, is knowing that God is going to rescue us during that time. Eventually, we're going to have to go through some things first to refine us and to purify us and to help us to understand who we truly are as the bride of Messiah and God's people, right? But ultimately, prosperity will be ushered in. And then Antiochus, what we learned during this summary is that, to be sure, the use of the term small horn in Daniel to describe both Antichrist in Daniel 7 and Antiochus in Daniel 8 solidifies the intended connection between these two figures that we studied, Antiochus Epiphanes and Antichrist himself. Let's continue with this summary and conclusion. What is more, during this topic, we learned Van Kampen draws attention to Christ's mention of Daniel's prophecy in Matthew 24:15, specifically in relation to the, quote, abomination of desolation, right? That was the verse that I'll flash a little screen grab in post-production, where Yeshua talks about how that when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, and then Matthew inserts the little commentary, the editorial comment, let the reader understand, right? And then Yeshua says at that point in time, well then, at that point in time, those who are in Judea, you guys need to get up and get out. You need to flee. This passage in Matthew 24:15 is paralleled by the passage in Luke chapter 21, where the details there are more given over to the military campaign that takes place during that time period. And so instead of Yeshua saying, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, instead he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by her armies, and then the wording picks up the same as in Matthew. So lets us know, when we overlay those two verses, the one in Matthew and the one with Luke, we see that's the same time period. The abomination of desolation, the desecration of the temple, takes place at the midpoint of the week, corresponds with Antichrist taking over Jerusalem and beginning an intense campaign against Jerusalem to occupy her and set his headquarters up there, which eventually he will. Let's keep reading this summary. I go on to say that this term, the abomination of desolation, originally applied to Antiochus in Daniel 11:31, is invoked by Jesus to allude to the actions of Antichrist. So we're talking about a term that has dual usage. Remember, when Yeshua mentioned those phrases, those terms in the Gospels, well, then Antiochus had already come and gone, right? It was past history. And yet he says, when you see this happen. So this clues us into that there must be something future. Of course, we know that in partial fulfillment or near-term fulfillment, prophetic telescoping again, we know that Yeshua was referring to what took place in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple, and the eventual 130s with the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem. So we know those events were in view as well. But if we carefully examine all of the details of what Yeshua is describing in his Olivet Discourse, and correlate that against not just Daniel, but correlate it against eventually what Paul wrote in Thessalonians and what John would go on to write in Revelation, if we correlate all of them together and corroborate all the details, we find that Yeshua's warning in Matthew 24:15 actually has a farther fulfillment, a future fulfillment, which corresponds to the Antichrist in the end of days. I go on to say that this parallel usage supports the intended meaning of the scriptures and strengthens the correlation between the two despots. And then I think I've got a few more paragraphs here, and we will finish this tonight, so just hang on there. I go on to say, Van Kampen, we're looking at a summary. Van Kampen argues that while the desecration of the temple by Antiochus in 168 BC fulfilled the prophecy in its immediate context, a future fulfillment awaits during the midpoint of Daniel's 70th week, just like I mentioned, aligning with the activities of Antichrist, which is exactly why we're studying the activities of Antichrist. And this aligns with his activities in the last days, including the desecration of a rebuilt temple. And those are details I just mentioned earlier. And then as we're winding down our study, again, we will finish this tonight. These are my own summary statements to the topic 6 that we've been looking at with Antichrist per Robert Van Kampen. Through the examination of Antiochus as a historical figure, this chapter in his book, The Sign, based on Van Kampen's research, provides valuable insights into Antichrist's strategies and the events of the end times. These are my own notes that I put together so that we can look at a summary and draw our study to a close here. I go on to say, the striking parallelism between these two despots serves to illuminate the meaning of the prophecies and offers a framework for comprehending future occurrences associated with the reign of Antichrist. Are you understanding what I'm trying to say there? We studied Antiochus Epiphanes so that we can be better prepared for when Antichrist himself hits the scene and begins to do all of these things. And using Daniel as our cue, we don't know exactly when. We don't know exactly when Antiochus is going to hit the scene, but we do know that the words of Daniel will have to come to their fullest conclusion at that point in time, because there's no other wicked rulers that are going to hit planet Earth. This is the final 7 years of humanity's rebellious push to throw off God and his Messiah, like we read about in Psalm chapter 2, right? The nations raged at God's establishing his righteous king on his holy hill. And so man is always going to resist God's rulership and his authority over him, because man is in rebellion against God. And so this last 7 years is the final effort of not just humanity, but ultimately the final last-ditch effort by Satan himself to try to overthrow God's rule, to upset the kingdom of Messiah, to destroy the offspring of Abraham, both physically and spiritually, etc., etc. So this is the time period that we're looking at, the last 7-year evil effort by Satan himself, which, of course, we've read the end of the book. We know is not going to succeed. God is going to defeat the Antichrist with the arrival of his son on planet Earth, and that's a day to look forward to. But we're using Antiochus Epiphanes as a forerunner in examining this particular event. So I say in closing, in my summary here, and with this I'll bring our study to a close. In my summary, I say, in conclusion, according to the research that Mr. Van Kampen's presented in this chapter, I think I got a typo there, apostrophe S where there shouldn't be one. According to the research that Mr. Van Kampen presented in this chapter, the parallels between Antiochus Epiphanes and Antichrist, as elucidated in Daniel's prophecies, reveal significant similarities in their actions, and, as we've noticed, they underscore the importance of these connections in interpreting eschatological prophecy. So, do yourself a favor. You want to understand end-time events, well, then look at what took place in partial fulfillment already in the book of Daniel. Don't start, and I'm saying this in closing as I look at my time here. We're ending a little early tonight. We didn't take the full hour, but that's fine. If you want to better understand end-time prophecy, which is what the word eschatology refers to, don't start with the book of Revelation or the book of 2 Thessalonians or the New Testament. Go backwards into the Old Testament and begin to look for details about God's description of these last days. Look for terms like the end of days, or in the final days, or in the last days, or in that day. That terminology is going to clue you into the idea that, and we talked about this a long time ago as well. I'll flash a little graphic on the screen and post so you guys can follow along. That there's coming a day, the 70th week of Daniel is going to include this very significant event that the Old Testament, the Tanakh, already termed the day of the Lord. And that is essentially the outpouring of God's judgment upon the wicked beast kingdom that Satan will have established during that time period, what we would recognize as the New World Order, the final beast empire in Satan's long line of beast empires. This will be the 8th, the final beast empire. God will eventually, at some point in the scope of events, cut this tribulation time short, rapture his church, and simultaneously begin to pour out judgment in retribution against the wicked beast system and against the wicked rulers and against those unrepentant sinners of that day. And so it's going to ramp up and culminate in the final, of course, destruction, or the final expulsion of the Antichrist and the false prophet, and the destruction of that final beast empire, and then the establishment of God's righteous kingdom here on earth, so we can usher in this final 1,000 years. The point I'm trying to highlight is that time period, that slice of history, as you can see on your screen in this 70th week of Daniel. There's probably a little segment there that's highlighted. The time period is already described in vivid detail in the Old Testament as the day of the Lord, or the Lord's day, the day of the Lord. And so that is the time period that we can begin to study first in the Tanakh. Then we move into the New Testament details with Paul's writings and Peter's letters, and eventually John's revelation, etc., etc. So that's my recommendation as you're studying end-time prophecy. Start back in the Old Testament and work your way towards using the day of the Lord and some of the other details, Antichrist, Antiochus. Look at the parallels. Make sure that you keep Jerusalem as your epicenter, because the Bible itself is Jerusalem-centric. It's Israel-centric. All of the events swirl around that area of the Middle East and other nations as they interact with Israel and Jerusalem, etc., etc. Don't be surprised if you're not finding significant prophecies, whether in the Old Testament or the New Testament, that detail what's happening in America or other parts of the world, Asia or Europe or things like that. Why? Because the Bible is an Israel-centric book, and end-time prophecy is central to Israel and Jerusalem and the temple and the activities surrounding the people in that particular area of the world. So it's no wonder why our focus on end-time nations and beasts and systems has to deal with nations that surround, that immediately impact Israel's borders right in that geographical area, right? We don't stray too far from that. So that's why we go the direction that we do. But that's going to do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. I hope you can join us again next week, where Bezat Hashem, which is Hebrew for Lord willing, will launch into topic number 7, Excursus, the Islamic Antichrist, per Joel Richardson. We'll see what happens when that time comes, okay?